Very welcome here this afternoon. My name is Eoin and I'm the Director of the Earth Institute, which seeks to promote interdisciplinary research on environment, climate and sustainability. We've a really diverse audience here from a number of government departments, state agencies, politics, think tanks, academia and many more, and you're all very welcome. Just by way of context, 2024 is the most significant election year, with about 60 countries comprising more than half the world's population going to the polls. And obviously we have our general election this week. So they timed it knowing we had this event. So thanks to the government for that. We had I don't know if you saw yesterday, we had an evaluation, or we supported an evaluation by a number of academics looking at the climate policies of different government parties, or different parties, which brought out some interesting findings. So you could have a look at that. The focus of the seminar today is on the capacity of democratic and legal institutions to deliver climate and environmental action. Special thanks to the UCD Dublin European Institute and the UCD Centre for Democracy Research working with us on this collaborative event, and to Antonio Soler and Katrina Devery for making today possible. And in anticipation, thanks to Aidan Regan, Andrew Jackson from UCD, Niamh Garvey from NESC, and Imelda Maher of the Dublin European Institute, who I will now introduce. So Imelda Maher is Sutherland Full Professor of European Law and Director of the UCD Dublin European Institute. She's published extensively on competition law and EU governance. A member of the Royal Irish Academy, she's currently Senior Vice President, an Honorary Bencher of Middle Temple London. She serves on the advisory board of the Cambridge Centre for European Legal Studies, the Max Planck Institute for Innovation and Competition, Munich, and the Institute for Consumer Antitrust Studies, Loyola University, Chicago. And in 2022, she was the Senior Emile Noel Global Fellow at the New York University School of Law. So I'm going to hand over now to Imelda, who's chair today's proceedings.
Thanks very much, Eoin. Hi, everyone. You're very, very welcome. I love this room. The Physics Theatre features in Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man. There's a conversation between the professor and David at this fireplace. So I always treasure any moment we have in this. So you're particularly welcome to this space today. I want to thank the Earth Institute, special thanks to Katrina, and I think a special thanks to Andrew, who's joining us online. We like to do things in person, but you don't want Andrew in the room at the moment, he's unwell, but he's well enough to do the talk. So thanks, Andrew, in advance. Delighted to introduce Aidan, who I've known since he started in UCD, Aidan. We did trips together to the European Institute with our students. What you do on tour stays on tour. Aidan is Professor of Political Economy at the School of Politics and International Relations, known as FIRE by those of us in UCD. And he was a former director, he's former director of the Dublin European Institute and remains thankfully on the board, as far as I'm concerned anyway. You're very well known, Aidan, to the wider public because of his monthly columns in the Sunday Business Post and his regular appearances in the media. But in addition, he's undertaken really groundbreaking research in the broader field of political economy. Most recently, he's secured a prestigious European Research Council grant for his latest project on inequality and democracy called Democracy Challenged: How Corporate Tax Avoidance Fuels the Wealth Inequalities That Undermine Democracy. Over to you.
Thank you. So I've been asked to stand here for the recording, right? So you can hear my voice. And apologies, I have a slight neck injury, so I'm like this. It's not because I'm avoiding people. I have to turn my neck a little bit to look like this. So thank you very much for the invitation to talk through this short presentation. This is part of a book project that I'm involved with with colleagues Tim Vlandas at Oxford, Hanna Schwander at the Humboldt University in Berlin, and Cyril Benoit at the Paris School of Economics in Paris. And we've been kind of tipping away on this book project and have various kind of spin-offs from it. And this is a kind of very, very brief, short presentation that captures, I think, the core concept of the book in particular. We title it The New Trilemma of Advanced Capitalism, Democracy, Growth, and Effective Climate Action. And to cut a long story short, the idea is you can't have all three. You can pick any two, but you can't have three. And we're kind of teasing out, or kind of engaging with the broader political and social science literature, the economic science literature as well, which has typically analyzed climate action or effective climate action independently from the question of whether or not you can generate the conditions for growth and prosperity within a liberal democracy and effectively tackle the climate crisis. And we kind of come to the conclusion that no, you can't. You need to have a trade-off here. There is a trade-off. And I think we need to start being a little bit more honest about that trade-off. And we kind of map out different scenarios in the book whereby we say on the left-hand side of the triangle here is what we call the status quo. This is kind of existing capitalist democracies today that are democratic governments, parties, political parties who are representatives of government, are responsive to voter interests, obviously. They try to build coalitions within society to form governments. They are responsive to incumbent economic interests, organized interests. So yeah, how do governments effectively respond to organized interests in society and voters while simultaneously generating the conditions to implement pretty large and radical reforms aimed at decarbonizing the economy and radically reforming various sectors, whether it's agriculture, transport, energy production, and then also generate the conditions for growth and prosperity within that tension. And we say at the moment, what's being the trade-off here, if you like, is that we have democracy and we are generating, and the priority is economic growth. The priority is to generate the conditions for growth, particularly for those voters that occupy in political science, the critical space between median and mean income, who ultimately formulate the conditions for majority governments, and to generate the conditions for growth and being responsive to those various democratic interests. But we think that this will not effectively solve the climate crises. Effective climate action here is defined as, well, as built into the Paris Agreement, effectively to reduce or to limit global temperature increases to less than 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And more specifically in the book, we get into the detail as it pertains to carbon inequalities, right? And this brings us to the second aspect of the trilemma here, which I think when we talk about democracy, we're not talking just about governments being responsive to voters and organized interests in society, but also being able to implement effective climate policies that don't generate increased inequality or don't amplify existing economic inequalities. So more specifically, we engage with the climate inequality literature. We have effectively, and there's people in this room who probably know the science much better than I do, but we effectively can emit 1,000 gigatons, 1,000 billion gigatons of CO2e equivalent emissions if we are to remain within our carbon budget to effectively limit global temperature increases to below 2 degrees. As most people in this room will know, we're very much on track for 3 or 4 degrees increases based on the fact that last year alone, we emitted, again, somebody can correct me in the precise details, 42 to 43 billion gigatons of emissions. So that effectively means, based on, if we were to just continue living as we are, we have 20 years, less than 20 years to reach those targets. So the scientific target has been set. How then do governments implement the policies in a democracy to achieve those targets? We think that's the fundamental tension here. We think the science is crystal clear. The problem is fundamentally political. How do you generate the political conditions to bring various groups in society and generate inclusive social coalitions amongst electorates within democracies, and also be simultaneously responsive to various organized interests in society, whether it's oil industry or whether it's the carbon industry or whether it's sponsoring and subsidizing clean technologies, etc. That basically boils down to the fact that in our democracies, in capitalist democracies, everybody has to reduce their emissions to about 2 tons per person, right? At present, on average, the bottom 50% of the income distribution emit about 6 tons. The middle class, that is the middle 40%, emit about 15 tons. The top 10% emit about 35 tons. And the top 1% of society emit over 100 tons of CO2e per year. So we think ultimately there is a deep inequality at the heart of the challenge and the trilemma here. So how do governments basically target those policies that do not lead to, quite frankly, a popular backlash against effective climate policies? So of course, and having had a brief chat at the break, one could make the case that therefore we need to give up on the idea of growth. That it's unrealistic to think that you can generate economic growth as we've had it for the past 100 years and effectively tackle the climate crises. And we engage very closely those debates in that literature. And again, it's probably not a surprise that a lot of the climate science literature is very much of that perspective, because nowhere ever has there been a society or a country that has managed to decouple carbon emissions effectively from economic growth. On top of that, there has never been a single country anywhere ever who has managed to generate the conditions for growth and not increase pollution. So increased economic growth thus far, up until this very point in time in history, has led to increased pollution, measured as CO2e emissions. So how do you decouple that, right? And I think the degrowth literature basically says, well, what we need to do is rethink our ideas of growth. We need to deepen democracy. We need to have a kind of new ecological paradigm, effectively much more decentralized decision-making, much more decentralized power structures, and we will effectively tackle the climate crisis, yes, and we will give up on economic growth, and we will do this in a democratic way. Now, even though normatively, I probably would be sympathetic to that idea, it does pose a very difficult question for political science, because we know from studies in political science, any government that effectively goes to voters and makes the case for degrowth is, quite frankly, not just laughed at, but unlikely, highly unlikely to ever get elected. So how do governments go to electorates and make the case for a rethinking of the economic paradigm, rethinking our measurements of growth as a solution to effectively tackle the climate crises, while also making the case normatively for some sort of degrowth paradigm? We don't dismiss that idea. We just think politically it's highly unlikely. And politically, the conditions to generate that type of narrative and that type of discourse is just not there at this present moment in time. But that, again, is not to say it's not normatively aspirational. It will achieve effective climate action by decoupling emissions from growth, and it could potentially do it within a democracy. We made the case that actually it would generate the conditions for a ferocious anti-democratic and anti-climate action backlash, which you see very clearly. The two main issues that generate popular support for the far right, for example, in Western Europe at this point in time, also in Eastern Central Europe, are immigration and the climate crisis, and those two things are intimately connected in their discourse. Finally, I've got 3 minutes left. We make the case that, look, one could, of course, pose the question at least. Maybe we need to recognize that if we want to generate the conditions for growth, maybe when in liberal democracies or maybe in capitalist democracies, voters would prioritize growth over democracy. Maybe the priority is accorded to capitalism over democracy. And it is possible to imagine a scenario whereby governments, the state that is in particular, effectively tackles the climate crisis by implementing pretty big radical economic reforms, whether it's in relation to macrofinance, whether it's kind of greening the macroeconomic fiscal and monetary policy regime, whether it's delegating these big climate policies to the central bank and empowering central banks, for example, and technocrats to do it, whether it's mirroring something what's happening in China in terms of direct investment, direct subsidies, and the complete transformation of the productive capacity of the economy, and generate growth and effectively tackle the climate crisis. But therefore, you would have to give up on democracy. It's hard to imagine a scenario whereby you have such a centralized technocratic state that effectively delegates those policies to a non-democratic, non-responsive, non-majoritarian institution. But then that's one scenario, okay? So we tease out the different dimensions of that. We call it the big green state, and we make the case, perhaps, even if you take Joe Biden's IRA Act, effectively, Inflation Reduction Act, which is basically a big piece of climate action policy. Even though that is ambitious and it gets close to effectively tackling some of the deeper problems here in climate crises, you could see just how difficult it was for the US to begin to implement that at the actual ground level, primarily because of huge pushback against incumbent economic interests, vested carbon industry interests, and also various parts of the electorate who vociferously oppose those type of changes to the type of shift in the industrial structure. So even if you did pursue something like that, a big green state, how do you generate the technocratic state capacity to actually implement those type of policies? So that's the scenario. We map it all out like that. Of course, we engage in the question that there is, under a given set of conditions, one could imagine that you achieve all three together, that you could effectively tackle the climate crises, generate the conditions for growth and prosperity within a responsive liberal democracy. But we think that's quite difficult and highly unlikely, and we need to start being honest about the tensions and trade-offs here within the social sciences in order to inform public debate. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Aidan. It's a strong dose of reality, I think, as we move on to the next speaker. And we're very happy to welcome Dr. Andrew Jackson, who's, as I explained, has to join us on Zoom today. Andrew is an assistant professor in UCD Dublin School of Law, an expert in environmental and planning law. He's published extensively in the fields and has been involved in public interest environmental and planning litigation for many years, including before the Irish, English and European courts. He's member of the Access Initiative and the Environmental Law Alliance worldwide, two global alliances of public interest environmental lawyers, scientists and other advocates. And what's Andrew's background is interesting because Andrew has a law degree from Oxford, became a solicitor in a top law firm, then went to work in Whitehall as a civil servant, has a PhD in geography, and then went to work with NGOs in Ireland. So he really covers what we would call impact space among academics and different disciplines. So over to you, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Imelda. And if you just bear with me 1 second, let me stop sharing my screen there just in order to give me access to the text of what I'm going to speak about today. Normally I wouldn't speak to a script, but in the context of a relatively short talk, the risk of me running over and freestyling, even with COVID, is high. So I'm going to ensure I keep to time and cover all the points that I want to accurately by speaking to my brief script here. So what I'm going to do today is speak about 3 linked themes in climate law that have emerged in the past years. The first is the rise of climate acts as a central part of the governance response to climate change. The most prominent early example is the UK's Climate Change Act of 2008. And we, of course, followed suit with our own Climate Act in 2015, although it wasn't until ours was amended in 2021 on foot of the Supreme Court's judgment in Friends of the Irish Environment that our act took on the form of what you might call a modern climate act, enshrining a net zero goal and the principle of carbon budgeting. By way of example of the utility of such budgeting, the UK, for example, met its first 3 carbon budgets and reduced its emissions, including from international aviation and shipping, significantly, by 50% compared to the 1990 level. While our emissions recently fell below the 1990 level for the first time since then, we clearly remain off track when it comes to complying with our own carbon budget programme, despite recent claims to the contrary. The second theme I'll mention is the rise of systemic climate litigation, by which I mean litigation that seeks to address a country's overarching response or ambition when it comes to climate change. This started with the famous Urgenda case in the Netherlands, which ended with victory in the Dutch Supreme Court in 2019 on the basis of the European Convention on Human Rights. The Urgenda case directly inspired the Friends of the Irish Environment case, known as Climate Case Ireland, which ran from 2017 to 2020. Ending, as you'll know, with victory for Friends of the Irish Environment before our Supreme Court, making ours only the second apex court globally to rule in favour of a climate litigant in a systemic case. As well as the direct impacts of this first wave of climate cases, by way of the adoption of more ambitious climate plans, amended climate acts, and so on, a notable feature of these cases has been the establishment of transnational climate norms and dialogue between national courts. We can see this very clearly in the case of Climate Case Ireland, for example, where Germany's highest court, the Federal Constitutional Court, cited our Supreme Court with approval in a key aspect of its judgment in the famous Neubauer case in 2021, and where the UK High Court gratefully adopted our Supreme Court's reasoning in finding the UK's net zero strategy unlawful in 2022. This brings me to my third and final theme, which is the respective roles of EU law, international law, and constitutional law. First, it's worth noting that EU law played essentially no role in the first wave of systemic climate cases. This was because these early cases sought to raise national climate ambition, while the evidence showed that EU climate law was anyway not aligned with what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was advising. In other words, litigants saw little point in seeking to enforce EU climate law because in any event, EU climate law was insufficiently ambitious to achieve the aims of the Paris Agreement. With this in mind, national litigants in effect leapfrogged EU law by seeking to show that national climate ambition that doesn't align with agreed climate science is an infringement of human rights law, and that compliance with EU law is not a good defence in this regard. Urgenda succeeded with this argument in the Netherlands, for example. This brings me to the European Court of Human Rights' recent judgment in the Swiss Klimasignorinen case, which established in essence that inadequate climate action is in breach of the ECHR. This judgment is effectively the new legal reality whose impacts have yet to be felt in national climate law. As has often been the case when climate litigants succeed, one reaction has been to characterise this as judicial overreach or as judges meddling in politics. However, I think that's clearly not the case. The European Court of Human Rights itself was at pains to emphasise its complementary role, stating that judicial intervention, including by this court, cannot replace or provide any substitute for the action which must be taken by the legislative and executive branches of government. However, democracy cannot be reduced to the will of the majority of the electorate and elected representatives in disregard of the requirements of the rule of law. The remit of domestic courts and the Court of Human Rights is therefore complementary to those democratic processes. Bringing us full circle, the Swiss judgment has given a powerful impetus for the adoption and implementation of climate acts, with the court referring to the need for a binding regulatory framework at the national level, followed by adequate implementation. The judgment has also broadened NGO standing in climate cases, allowing NGOs to litigate personal human rights before the European Court of Human Rights itself. In this regard, the European Court of Human Rights reached the opposite conclusion to the one reached by our own Supreme Court, and it's only a matter of time before our Supreme Court will be asked to reconsider this question of NGO standing. The Swiss judgment has also clearly given hugely increased prominence to the European Convention in climate matters, and it's going to be very interesting to see whether the interpretation of national constitutions, including Ireland's, will develop in tandem, or whether constitutions will come to play a secondary role in the climate context. Finally, on the substance, the Swiss judgment is hugely significant. It requires countries to take measures that are capable of preventing harm and sets a reduced margin of appreciation for the setting of aims and commitments in this regard. A state's primary duty, says the court, is to adopt and to effectively apply in practice regulations and measures capable of mitigating the existing and potentially irreversible future effects of climate change. This primary duty entails each country quantifying a national carbon budget in light of the remaining global carbon budget for holding global temperature increase below 1.5 degrees Celsius, based on a fair share determination. This judgment therefore provides a powerful tool in the hands of future climate litigants to hold governments accountable, to raise ambition, and to pin countries with responsibility for their carbon debt, even as the global carbon budget diminishes to zero. 4 climate cases are currently ongoing in Ireland as part of a second wave. 3 of the cases have been brought by Friends of the Irish Environment, while the 4th has been brought by community law and mediation alongside a number of individuals. The first case challenges the substance of Ireland's long-term climate strategy on the basis that the strategy does not comply with our Climate Act or with EU law. The second case challenges the adoption of our so-called sectoral emissions ceilings, that is, the process of sharing out the agreed carbon budgets to 2030 between different sectors. The third case is a challenge to the Climate Action Plan 2023, seeking to apply the reasoning in a UK judgment to our own situation. And the fourth is a challenge to Climate Action Plan 2024 on grounds that include the European Court of Human Rights' recent judgment in the Swiss case, amongst others. Developments in all these cases will clearly be closely watched in Ireland and abroad. In summary, we now have a powerful and ever-growing armoury of legal tools to hold governments accountable to address the climate emergency. Significantly, these are tools that governments themselves created as part of our democratic system. Important ongoing issues relating to the use and effectiveness of these tools include barriers to accessing justice, the framing of effective remedies, and vigilance against unjustifiable claims that application of the law is an affront to democracy. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Andrew. We'll see you again later when we have our Q&A session. And thank you for staying to time. It's hard when you're a chair and someone's on screen and you can't control them. So I really appreciate that. Our final speaker then is Niamh Garvey, who's a senior policy analyst with the National Economic and Social Council, known as NESC to most of us, where she works on sustainable development and climate action. She was previously head of policy and advocacy at Trócaire, which the Irish in the audience we know is an Irish international development organisation working in 17 countries across Africa, Asia and Latin America, where she led a team of policy and advocacy advisors working on climate change, sustainable agriculture, business and human rights and international finance. She held previous roles in research and advocacy at Christian Aid and the Institute of Development Studies, and has served as a board director on a number of NGOs, including Debt and Development Coalition Ireland, Friends of the Earth, and Ireland and the Fair Trade Mark. Over to you, Niamh. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here today. And I've really enjoyed the previous two speakers. So I suppose I'm going to maybe narrow in a little bit from, I guess, the broader discussion we've just been having to focus, I suppose, specifically on the role of NESC as an independent multi-stakeholder council. And I suppose I'm going to focus on the potential for this to support greater civil society engagement in policy. But clearly it's not suggesting that this is the answer to all of the kinds of issues that we've just been discussing, but the potential contribution of institutions such as these advisory councils in supporting, I suppose, democratic process around climate and other environmental and indeed broader social and economic issues. So I guess there are different types of advisory bodies in Irish policy making, and I guess we were just focusing on the legal there, and the carbon budgets came up. So I suppose another body such as the Climate Change Advisory Council plays a vital role in independent, so scientific and expert advice as part of that process. But NESC is, I suppose, a different type of advisory body. It's chaired by the Secretary General of the Department of the Taoiseach, and its role is providing research, dialogue and advice that helps achieve Ireland's sustainable economic, social and environmental development. So the advice really is based on, I suppose, that collective view across a diverse range of stakeholders. So it's that sort of stakeholder representative role that is at its heart, in contrast to perhaps maybe a scientific expertise, as in the case of the Climate Change Advisory Council. The members represent different pillars, social pillars across society, and the members are listed there on the slide. So they include, I suppose, representatives across the social, the economic, as well as the environmental, with 3 representatives each from the business and employers organisations, 3 each from the Irish Congress of Trade Unions, 3 from farming and agricultural organisations, the community and voluntary pillar, the environment pillar, and so on. Together then with representatives of the public service across senior civil servants across government departments, and then a number of independent nominees who are nominated by the Taoiseach. And that's all supported by a secretariat, and I work in the secretariat as a policy analyst. The environment, I guess, has been a bigger part of NESC's work since around 2012. And this was following the dissolution of the core Sustainable Development Council that had existed prior to that. And it was at this stage that the environment pillar was added into the NESC Council. So I suppose just that environmental remit, I guess, is a more recent development for the Council. And I think it's really important to note, given that the day's focus is on the issue of democracy, but I suppose there are similar advisory councils around Europe. We're part of a European network, and while they might share having, I suppose, the representation from different social pillars, it's not always the case that they are nominated from within the pillars. They can often be, I suppose, appointed by government or other institutions. But in the Irish case, each of the pillars represent. They nominate, or they identify, they nominate on their own 3 representatives. So in that sense, it's a sort of maybe more bottom-up democratic representation across the members. So how NESC works? Well, I think certainly in recent years, NESC focuses very much on, I suppose, knotty issues, wicked problems, issues that really have, I suppose, a social, economic and environmental tension at their core. So Aidan was talking, I guess, about that trilemma, the fact that we're confronted, I guess, with trade-offs, possibly synergies, but certainly trade-offs across many of the issues that we face. And this seems to be an increasing characteristic of many of the policy challenges that we're facing. I suppose that complexity, uncertainty, and wickedness of problems seems to only be increasing. And these are the kind of issues that NESC primarily focuses on. And it provides advice on policy. It doesn't set policy. So where work comes from, it can be, I suppose, bottom up. So the council, the members of the council inform what the work programme might be. But equally, sometimes there are requests that come from government. So maybe in more sort of top-down sort of example of where work comes into the NESC programme, where government is seeking advice on a given issue. An example of this would be the wellbeing framework. Ireland developed a wellbeing framework about 3 years ago, and there was a request to NESC, I suppose, to engage across a wide range of stakeholders and experts around the content of such a wellbeing framework. Whereas maybe a bottom-up example, there might be numerous, but in terms of my own work, a report that was published in 2023 on just transition in agriculture and land use was something identified as an important area for the council to focus on, coming from within the work programme developed by the council itself. So work is initiated, then primary, secondary research, stakeholder engagement, council deliberation, all happen over the course of, it might be a couple of months, or it might be as long as 18 months, or I think some projects have run to 2 years. So there is a significant emphasis on that process of really engaging in the research and engaging with stakeholders as part of that research process, with then drafts and a final report ultimately going for council approval. There might be rounds of revisions, and ultimately, once the report is approved, it is the report plus a memo to government go to government and are tabled at cabinet. So they land, I guess, within the policy system. It doesn't completely end there. So following publication, there's a public publication, public launch, policy workshops, I suppose, bringing the findings and the recommendations out for a wider audience. And also engagements with officials. So NESC Secretariat might be involved within I suppose drawing on the advice that they've provided on one issue within a report, might be invited into sort of working groups and so on as part of the policy system. So as a current example, I'm engaged in the land use review phase 2 as a follow-on really from the findings of the Just Transition in Agriculture and Land Use report. Our report on Just Transition in Agriculture and Land Use had made some recommendations about how the land use review could be informed by thinking around just transition, and as a follow-up, I suppose we're engaged then within the policy system and sort of taking that thinking and that advice forward, by way of an example. So my final slide, and how I am for time, but I don't think I've seen a card yet.
3 minutes.
3 minutes, grand. Final slide here then. So NESC celebrated our 50th anniversary last year, and I guess it represented a period of, reflection. There was a programme of work and a major conference held just this time last year, in fact. So I suppose that period of reflection is sort of understanding the strengths and the contribution that NESC makes, as well as, I suppose, looking forward to, I guess, how the future looks and what our role is going forward. So I'll just draw out 3 kind of reflections. One is that, I suppose, a key strength of the council is that depth of analysis, as literature review, data analysis, international case studies, local case studies, frontline, the experiences of people on the ground, as it were, together with expert analysis, all sort of come together in an interdisciplinary or a multidisciplinary approach. I suppose looking forward, I guess, as the kinds of, I suppose, as Aidan was referring to, maybe there are sort of disciplines, our core disciplines maybe are changing as they grapple with the challenges of the future. Equally, I suppose, in recent years, the council have engaged in more participatory and co-creation kind of approaches, and we anticipate this kind of approach maybe deepening as we go forward. A second contribution, I guess, or a second strength is that the breadth of representation. So I went through kind of the current representation across government departments, social pillars, independent experts, and so on. But as part of our 50th anniversary, we held a dedicated strand of work engaging young people in council. So there aren't sort of youth organisations representatives as a formal part of the council. So we really sought to sort of widen that reach during the 50th anniversary. And I suppose questions going forward are, our ongoing relevance in terms of diversity and those sort of more local and links through to national. So these are kind of issues that were well discussed in our conference last year, and that we're, grappling with that, maintaining relevance going forward and maintaining diversity going forward. And then the final reflection is, I guess, what really seems to be valued as the overall contribution is this sort of safe space. If many of the issues, again, that Aidan referred to, are talking about complexity, uncertainty, difficult trade-offs, and particularly trying to have longer term thinking as well as maybe that shorter term response, having a sort of safe space for the different perspectives, the different interests to, I suppose, unpack these things, to talk about that sort of the trade-offs, to really have a solutions focus and come to some sort of consensus building as we grapple with these tricky issues, is a really valuable contribution, I think, within the policy system. A key issue has come up, I guess, across the board is, you know, implementation of really good policy, and Andrew's reflections on the role of certainly the litigation maybe within that. There's, I suppose, there's lots of ways of considering implementation going forward. And as I mentioned, NESC is not a policy making forum, but certainly on our agenda is about how the advice that we provide can support, you know, implementation as well as good policy making. So I look forward to the discussion and any reflections others may have on this. Thank you.